The horizon glowed faintly, with the first pale light of dawn, as a Zero fighter cut through the cool spring air above the East China Sea. Inside the cramped cockpit, a young Japanese pilot gripped the stick tightly, his leather gloves damp with sweat. He had risen before dawn, shared a silent meal of rice and pickled vegetables with his comrades, and written his final words on delicate paper, farewell notes meant to be delivered to his family if he did not return. Now, with the rising sun at his back, he believed he was flying toward immortality. His orders were clear: find the American fleet off Okinawa, dive into its largest ship, and die as a weapon of the Emperor. Yet, as the sea stretched endlessly below, something unexpected filled the sky before him. Bright white tracers arced upward in perfectly measured streams, and the air shuddered with black bursts of exploding flak. The Americans knew he was coming. He had been detected long before his eyes could find their ships. His mission, built on surprise and speed, had been undone by something invisible, something watching him long before he arrived. What the pilot experienced in those terrifying moments was the cutting edge of modern warfare. Radar, once a theoretical curiosity, had matured into a decisive tool of battle. For Japanese aviators, it felt like witchcraft, unseen waves sweeping the sky, painting a picture of their approach before the human eye could detect it. For American sailors and airmen, it was salvation, a system that turned the chaos of defense into a coordinated, deadly shield. And nowhere did this contest reach its peak more brutally than at Okinawa, where radar pickets, destroyers stationed far ahead of the main fleet, formed the outer wall against wave after wave of kamikazes. The battle for Okinawa was unlike anything the Pacific War had yet witnessed. By the spring of 1945, Japan was cornered. Its empire had shrunk dramatically, its fleet lay broken, and its skies had become a hunting ground for American bombers. Yet its leaders still hoped to delay, to bleed, and to make the cost of invasion so unbearable that the United States might hesitate before striking the home islands. Out of this desperation came the Special Attack Corps, the Kamikazes, men trained not to survive but to die. At Okinawa, they would be unleashed on an unprecedented scale. More than 1,500 sorties aimed at annihilating the American fleet supporting the landings. But the Americans were not blind. Months of planning had gone into preparing for this storm. The solution was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Station small warships, mostly destroyers, dozens of miles away from the main fleet. These ships, equipped with advanced air search radars, would extend the fleet's eyes far beyond the horizon. The radar pickets could detect incoming formations, relay their positions, and direct fighters to intercept. They were the early warning guardians of the entire operation. Yet this role was as perilous as it was essential. Isolated and exposed, the picket ships became the first and most obvious targets for the kamikazes. They absorbed the fury meant for aircraft carriers and battleships, often at terrible cost. The Japanese pilot who felt the sting of radar-directed fire that morning was one of hundreds who would confront this new reality. Instead of swooping undetected over the ocean to strike at anchored carriers, they found themselves funneled into deadly gauntlets of anti-aircraft fire, with Hellcat and Corsair fighters already climbing to meet them. The surprise, the essence of their sacrifice, was stripped away. Many would never even glimpse the decks of the great carriers they were sworn to destroy. For the Americans manning the radar pickets, the experience was equally harrowing. Sailors aboard destroyers like USS Laffey, USS Bush, and USS Cassin Young learned that their mission meant constant battle stations, endless tension, and the near certainty of attack. They listened to the radar scopes crackle with the approach of enemy aircraft and braced for the impact of suicide planes that seemed to emerge from the sea itself. The men called these lonely outposts Picket Hell. The scene on Okinawa's approaches was apocalyptic. Explosions thundered across the water, smoke trails twisted in the sky, and the endless drone of approaching planes carried with it the promise of fire and steel. Japanese pilots prayed to their ancestors as they dove, while American gunners shouted hoarse commands over the roar of their 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons. The radar pickets bought seconds, minutes, sometimes only fragments of time. But those fragments meant the difference between a carrier surviving or being struck, between hundreds of sailors living or dying. The story of the radar pickets is one of sacrifice and endurance, of men who understood their ships were shields. It is also the story of technology maturing under the crucible of war, of radar transforming naval defense into something that stunned even the most determined attackers. For Japanese pilots, the pickets were proof that their final missions were not as certain as they had been promised. For the Americans, they became grim lifelines, standing alone at the edge of battle to protect the fleet. The dawn over Okinawa was not just the beginning of another day in the Pacific. It was the unveiling of a new kind of war, one fought not only with guns and planes, but with invisible eyes sweeping the sky. And as kamikazes hurled themselves at the picket line, a terrible rhythm was established, sacrifice answering sacrifice, technology colliding with desperation, until the waters off Okinawa became one of the bloodiest proving grounds in the history of naval warfare. In the winter of 1939, long before Okinawa, a small team of British scientists stood in a windswept field on the coast of Suffolk, staring at a lattice of steel towers that hummed faintly against the gray sky. Inside the low buildings at the base, glowing cathode ray screens pulsed with ghostly green lines, flickering each time an aircraft crossed the horizon. For the first time in history, men could see with invisible eyes, peering beyond sight and darkness. They called it radio detection and ranging, radar. It was crude, experimental, and fragile, but it hinted at something transformative. The men watching those screens understood they had opened a new chapter in warfare. The enemies of Britain did not. What began as a desperate scientific project on the eve of war became, in only a few years, one of the most decisive technologies of the Second World War. Britain, fearing annihilation from the skies, poured resources into radar as a means of survival. The result was the Chain Home Network, tall masts stretching along the English coast, tied into fighter command and ground observers. When the Luftwaffe launched the Battle of Britain in 1940, radar allowed the Royal Air Force to scramble its fighters not by guesswork, but by exact knowledge of where the enemy was coming. This was the first great test of radar, and it saved Britain from destruction. Across the Atlantic, American scientists were already watching closely. The United States Navy, aware of its vulnerability across the wide Pacific, had been experimenting with radio detection since the 1930s. At MIT, Harvard, and the Naval Research Laboratory, engineers refined shorter wavelength radar sets that could be mounted on ships and even aircraft. The need was obvious. The Pacific was vast, and battles at sea could turn on minutes of warning. If radar could extend vision beyond the horizon, fleets could maneuver with confidence, intercept with precision, and, most importantly, defend against sudden attack. By December 1941, when Japan struck Pearl Harbor, radar was still in its infancy. Hawaii did have an operational radar station on Oahu, and it even detected the incoming Japanese strike. But the operators, inexperienced and uncertain, assumed the blips represented American bombers arriving from the mainland. No alarms were raised, and minutes later, Japanese planes swooped over Battleship Row. It was a bitter irony. The technology that might have given the defenders precious time had already been invented, but it was not yet trusted. The lesson would not be forgotten. In the frantic months that followed Pearl Harbor, radar became a priority on a scale few could have imagined. American industry, already mobilizing to levels of unprecedented capacity, poured out not only tanks, planes, and ships, but also thousands of radar sets. Engineers created models such as the SCR-270 long-range air search radar, the SC series fitted on destroyers and carriers, and specialized fire control radars that could lock guns onto targets with unerring accuracy even at night. Factories in Massachusetts, Illinois, and California worked around the clock, producing tubes, oscillators, and cathode displays. By 1943, the United States was not only matching, but surpassing Britain in radar production. For the Japanese, the story unfolded very differently. Japanese scientists were not ignorant of radar, but their efforts were underfunded and fragmented. A handful of sets were developed, and some were even deployed on warships late in the war, but they were primitive compared to Allied designs. Japanese commanders placed greater faith in traditional observation, in the keen eyesight of pilots and lookouts. In a culture that prized individual skill and spiritual determination, radar seemed a distant, impersonal tool. It was a miscalculation that would prove devastating. The Pacific, unlike Europe, became the first true testing ground for radar in naval warfare. Carrier battles like Coral Sea and Midway were fought over ranges where visual spotting was useless. Radar-equipped American ships were able to track approaching aircraft and coordinate combat air patrols more effectively than their Japanese counterparts. At Midway in June 1942, while radar did not decide the battle outright, it gave the Americans precious moments of readiness. As the war expanded into the Solomons and the Central Pacific, radar proved increasingly indispensable. Night battles around Guadalcanal revealed its power most starkly. In the darkness, Japanese ships relied on their superbly trained lookouts and long-range torpedoes, while American cruisers and destroyers began to use radar to detect enemy vessels before they could be seen. Though early mistakes and inexperience led to costly losses, by 1943 the U.S. Navy had developed doctrines for radar-directed gunnery and interception. By 1944, the transformation was unmistakable. Radar was no longer an experimental aid. It was the nervous system of the fleet. Entire battles were fought through its scope. Aircraft carriers used radar to track incoming raids hundreds of miles away, vectoring fighters into position with precision. Battleships and cruisers fired their big guns guided by radar fire control, hitting targets through smoke, rain, or darkness. Destroyers equipped with the newest sets became the fleet's watchmen, scanning the skies and seas with invisible beams. The invisible had become decisive. The scale of Allied investment was staggering. By the end of the war, the United States alone had produced over 100,000 radar sets of various types. Portable ground-based radar was carried by Marines onto island beaches. Long-range early warning radars stretched across newly built airfields in the Pacific. Even aircraft themselves carried compact radars that allowed them to hunt submarines at night or guide bombers through cloud and darkness. Each set represented not just technology, but the labor of thousands of engineers, factory workers, and technicians back home. The war effort had fused science and industry into a war machine that could overwhelm its enemies. For Japanese aviators and sailors, the growing Allied mastery of radar was a mystery at first. Reports filtered back that American fighters seemed to appear exactly where they were least expected, and that American ships could fire with deadly accuracy even when cloaked in fog or darkness. Slowly, Japanese forces realized they were fighting an enemy that could see what they could not. By the time Okinawa loomed in 1945, radar was not only a tool but the very backbone of American defense. Yet radar did not come without cost. For those who operated it, the strain was immense. Radar operators lived in darkened rooms, eyes fixed on glowing screens, ears pressed to headsets, responsible for the survival of entire task forces. They were often young, barely out of high school, trained in crash courses that condensed years of science into weeks. Their judgments carried life or death weight. A blip on a screen could mean hundreds of lives, a carrier saved or lost. These invisible warriors formed an unseen front line, one that demanded discipline, endurance, and constant vigilance. By the spring of 1945, as the American fleet gathered for the assault on Okinawa, radar had reached its peak as a tool of naval warfare. It was integrated into every layer of defense: long-range search, fighter direction, gunfire control, and early warning. It represented the triumph of Allied science and industry, and the culmination of lessons learned from years of bitter fighting. For the Japanese pilots preparing for their final missions, it was an unseen adversary more formidable than steel or gunpowder. It robbed them of surprise, stripped away their last advantage, and turned the open sea into a killing field long before they ever glimpsed their targets. The birth of radar warfare in the Pacific was not a quiet revolution. It reshaped strategy, altered the balance of power, and created a new dimension of combat where the unseen dictated the fate of fleets. And as the waves of kamikazes prepared to throw themselves at Okinawa, it was radar that stood waiting, silent, invisible, and merciless in its precision. In the gray pre-dawn of 1940, inside a cramped operations hut on the coast of southern England, young radar operators leaned over glowing green screens. Outside, the towers of the new chain home system stretched into the mist, silent sentinels against the storm gathering across the channel. On their scopes, faint lines trembled, signals bouncing back from approaching aircraft. Within minutes, the dots coalesced into a wave. The Luftwaffe was on its way. For the first time in history, a nation saw its attackers before they arrived, not with human eyes, but through invisible waves pulsing through the air. Britain's survival would rest upon this untested technology. Radar, radio detection and ranging, was born from both scientific curiosity and mortal necessity. The groundwork had been laid in the interwar years, when researchers in Britain, the United States, and Germany experimented with radio waves and their reflections. Yet it was Britain, staring down the threat of Hitler's bombers, that invested first on a national scale. Under the urgent guidance of Sir Robert Watson Watt, the chain home network was erected along the coastline. When the Battle of Britain erupted in the summer of 1940, this network gave the Royal Air Force precious minutes to scramble fighters exactly where they were needed. Pilots spoke later of how uncanny it seemed. They would be vectored to altitude, turn on command, and find the enemy right in their sights. To them, it felt like wizardry, but it was radar that gave the RAF its edge, and with it, the chance to resist annihilation. Across the Atlantic, American naval officers watched carefully. Their war, when it came, would be fought not over London or the Channel, but across the endless reaches of the Pacific Ocean. Distance, surprise, and speed would dictate survival. Since the 1930s, engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory and universities like MIT had tinkered with prototypes. The SCR-270, a long-range air search radar, emerged just in time to be deployed to Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7, 1941, that radar picked up the approaching Japanese strike force more than 130 miles out. Yet the warnings went unheeded, dismissed as friendly bombers, and minutes later, the Arizona burned in the harbor. America learned the same bitter truth Britain already knew. Radar was only as powerful as the trust and doctrine built around it. From that moment on, radar became a wartime obsession. Factories across America, already straining to produce tanks, ships, and aircraft, began churning out radar sets in the tens of thousands. By 1943, Massachusetts and California laboratories had refined models small enough to mount on destroyers, submarines, and even night fighters. The SC and SK series naval radars gave American ships eyes that could see beyond the curve of the Earth, detecting squadrons hundreds of miles away. On carriers, combat information centers were established, darkened rooms crowded with young sailors staring at scopes, directing fighters like chess pieces on a vast board. Meanwhile, the Japanese Empire miscalculated. Their scientists were capable, but the Navy and Army treated radar as secondary, even exotic. A handful of rudimentary sets were deployed late in the war, but most Japanese ships and airfields relied on human lookouts. In a military culture that prized sharp eyes, instinct, and courage, radar appeared cold and mechanical. This neglect would cost them dearly. Reports from the Solomons and Central Pacific confused Japanese pilots. American fighters seemed to appear from nowhere, and U.S. warships could fire with uncanny precision through fog and night. The truth was simple. The Allies had invested not only in radar itself, but in the vast web of training, production, and doctrine needed to make it lethal. The Pacific became the crucible for radar warfare. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, and at Midway a month later, long-range air search radar allowed American carriers to detect raids while still hundreds of miles distant. The advantage was not yet perfect. Radar information was often slow to relay, and operators lacked combat experience, but the seeds had been planted. By late 1942, in the bloody night battles of Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy began to wield radar with deadly effect. Cruisers and destroyers equipped with SG surface search sets could track Japanese ships before they were visible. At first, the learning curve was steep. American formations still suffered terrible losses in confused night fights. But gradually, radar-directed gunnery began to change the balance, allowing American ships to hit targets their adversaries could not see. The human dimension of this revolution was no less dramatic. Radar operators were often boys barely out of high school, trained in crash courses that compressed advanced physics into weeks. They worked in dark compartments, staring at glowing screens, their judgments carrying the weight of entire task forces. A flicker on the scope might be a glitch, or the first sign of an incoming attack. Their voices over headsets directed squadrons of Hellcats and Corsairs to intercept. They were anonymous, unseen, but without them, carriers and battleships would have been blind. By 1944, radar was no longer an experimental accessory. It was the nervous system of the fleet. At the Marianas, radar allowed Admiral Spruance to position his carriers for the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, directing hundreds of American fighters to intercept incoming Japanese raids before they reached the fleet. At Leyte Gulf, radar gave early warning of the Japanese center force approaching through the San Bernardino Strait. Each engagement reinforced the same lesson. The side that saw first could strike first, and the side that struck first almost always won. By the time the invasion of Okinawa approached, radar had become more than technology. It was doctrine. It dictated how fleets were arranged, how fighters were dispatched, and how ships survived against overwhelming attack. The Japanese would unleash their kamikazes in numbers never before seen, hoping that mass sacrifice could overwhelm American defenses. But this time, radar stood in their path. It would strip away the element of surprise and turn the ocean into a vast killing ground. For the men of the Special Attack Corps, the discovery was brutal. The Americans could see them long before they could see the Americans. The birth of radar warfare was not just the tale of scientists and engineers, but of entire nations harnessing knowledge under the hammer of war. It began with faint echoes on a screen in a hut in Britain, and by 1945 it had grown into the invisible shield that guarded the mightiest fleets ever assembled. As the waters off Okinawa churned with smoke and fire, radar became the difference between life and death, survival and annihilation. It was the unseen hand shaping the course of the Pacific War, and it was about to meet its greatest test. The cherry blossoms were in bloom that spring, drifting softly across airfields where young Japanese pilots prepared for death. In cramped wooden barracks near Kyushu, men in flight suits sat on tatami mats, writing farewell letters in neat brushstrokes. They addressed their mothers, their fathers, their childhood friends, and in many cases, young women they had never confessed their feelings to. The letters spoke of honor, duty, and sacrifice, but between the lines was the unmistakable weight of finality. A ceremonial cup of sake was passed from hand to hand. Some men smiled bravely, others wept quietly, but all knew that when their planes left the runway the next morning, they would not return. For these men of the Special Attack Corps, or Tokubetsu Kogakitai, life had been transformed into a single mission: to become a weapon. By the spring of 1945, Japan's air power was nearly exhausted. The once mighty Imperial Navy Air Service, which had humbled Allied forces at Pearl Harbor and struck fear across the Pacific, was a shell of its former self. Years of attritional battles in the Solomons, the Marshalls, and the Philippines had drained its pilots and consumed its aircraft. Japan's factories, hammered by American bombers, could no longer produce modern fighters in sufficient numbers, nor could its training schools graduate skilled aviators fast enough. Against the swelling tide of American industry, thousands of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Liberators rolling off assembly lines each month, Japan's remaining air wings were outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. It was under these dire circumstances that desperation hardened into doctrine. The kamikaze, once a fringe tactic, became an official strategy. The concept was simple, if horrifying. An aircraft, loaded with explosives and piloted by a volunteer, could inflict catastrophic damage by diving directly into a ship. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first organized special attack missions had struck American carriers and escorts with shocking effect. The Japanese High Command seized upon the results. If pilots were scarce and planes few, then every mission must count. At Okinawa, the culmination of this doctrine arrived. The invasion of Okinawa, launched on April 1, 1945, represented the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Nearly 1,500 ships, including 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, and 200 destroyers, supported the landings of 500,000 men. To the Japanese leadership, this armada was both a threat and an opportunity. If the American fleet could be crippled here, perhaps the invasion of the home islands could be delayed, or even prevented. And so the skies above Okinawa became the stage for the largest suicide assault in military history. Operation 10 Go and its subsequent waves unleashed more than 1,500 kamikaze sorties over 3 months. Pilots took off in groups of 5, 10, or 20, flying obsolete Zeros, Ki-43 Oscars, and even training aircraft crudely modified for combat. Each carried a 500-pound bomb or had been loaded with fuel to turn the plane itself into a fireball. Their instructions were blunt: find the enemy fleet, target the largest vessel, and crash into it with precision. Some squadrons coordinated their attacks with conventional bomber and fighter escorts, while others flew alone, low over the waves, hoping to slip past American defenses. For American sailors, life aboard the radar pickets and escorting ships became a waking nightmare. Every day, klaxons blared as incoming raids appeared on radar screens. The operators in combat information centers vectored fighter patrols to intercept, but not all could be stopped. Lookouts scanned the horizon, voices raw from shouting, as gunners loaded their 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons. The sky erupted in thunder each time a kamikaze wave approached, tracer rounds clawing upward, flak bursts speckling the air. Yet for all the firepower, some planes always broke through. Sailors learned to watch the silver specks grow larger, screaming downward, until they ended in a blinding flash and a shockwave that rattled steel hulls. The effect on both sides was deeply human. Japanese pilots carried lockets, charms, and family mementos in their cockpits, some tucked in the cherry blossom branches handed to them for takeoff, a symbol of fleeting life and sacrifice. They took off knowing their mission was not to return, convinced that their deaths might save Japan. Meanwhile, American sailors braced for impact daily, sleeping in damp uniforms, knowing that death might arrive in seconds. They lived with a grim calculus. Each kamikaze destroyed by flak or fighters meant lives saved, but each one that got through could claim dozens, even hundreds of men. Statistics reveal the scale of the horror. During the Okinawa campaign, kamikazes sank 36 American ships and damaged more than 360 others. Nearly 5,000 sailors were killed, and thousands more wounded. Destroyers on the radar picket line bore the worst of it, targeted relentlessly because they were first in the path. Some, like USS Bush and USS Colhoun, were hit multiple times in a single day before finally sinking. Others, like USS Laffey, endured attacks of almost unimaginable intensity and somehow survived. For crews on these vessels, each sunrise meant another trial by fire. The psychological shock was immense. For the Americans, it was unlike any other form of warfare. An enemy who refused to preserve his own life, who came not to fight and return, but to die in order to kill. This defied the expectations of battle. Sailors described watching kamikazes ignore crippling damage, wings aflame, cockpits shattered, yet still plunging toward their target. For the Japanese pilots, the shock was equally profound. Many had been told that American defenses were soft, that their sacrifice would guarantee success. Instead, they encountered radar-guided fire and swarms of interceptors, making their final journeys not glorious charges, but frantic struggles to reach the enemy. The surge of kamikazes at Okinawa was not simply a military tactic. It was the final manifestation of Japan's desperation. It was the belief that sacrifice could substitute for strategy, that individual death could outweigh industrial might. But in the clash between ideology and technology, it was radar, gunnery, and sheer American firepower that held. Even so, the cost to the defenders was enormous. Okinawa became a battlefield where heroism and tragedy intertwined, where young men wrote their farewells on one side of the sea, and others braced to repel them on the other. The waves of suicide planes did not break the American fleet, but they carved scars into its crews and seared themselves into memory. And as the battle wore on, both kamikazes and the men who faced them came to a shared realization. This was not just combat, but a storm of desperation, sacrifice, and survival that would define the final chapter of the Pacific War. The sea was calm on the morning when USS Bush took her station on the far edge of the fleet, her silhouette a lonely figure against the horizon. Sailors on deck smoked cigarettes and squinted into the bright Pacific sky, knowing their assignment was among the most dangerous in the Okinawa campaign. As part of the radar picket line, Bush was not sheltered by the bulk of the main task force. She was an isolated sentinel, her radar dish sweeping the heavens, her crew fully aware that if Japanese aircraft came, they would strike here first. Hours passed in uneasy quiet until a buzz grew faint in the distance. Then came the shriek of engines, the sudden roar of guns, and the first kamikazes appeared, diving straight out of the sun. In that moment, the men of Bush and her sister ships realized what the radar picket role truly meant. They would be both the fleet's eyes and its sacrifice. The radar picket system had been conceived as both ingenious and cruel. By stationing destroyers and destroyer escorts 20 to 50 miles ahead of the main fleet, commanders extended their vision far beyond the horizon. The radars aboard these ships, SC, SK, and SP series, could detect incoming raids long before the enemy was in striking distance. Fighter direction teams aboard relayed coordinates, vectoring patrols of Hellcats and Corsairs to intercept. But this gift of forewarning came at a price. The picket ships, isolated and exposed, became irresistible targets. Japanese pilots soon learned that the destroyers were not only vulnerable but vital. Destroy the pickets, and the Americans would be blind. USS Bush, a Fletcher-class destroyer, experienced this reality in one of the earliest and bloodiest clashes. On April 6, 1945, Bush was on radar picket duty when she came under wave after wave of kamikaze attacks. Her gunners opened fire, filling the sky with tracers and flak bursts, downing several attackers. But 3 aircraft broke through. 1-0 slammed into the port side, tearing open her hull. Another crashed near the stern, shattering the deck and sending flames roaring into the compartments. A third dived straight into the bridge, killing officers in a flash of fire and twisted steel. The crew fought desperately to save their ship, but by evening Bush was sinking beneath the waves. 94 of her crew perished. Hundreds more floated in oil-slicked water until rescue came. Her sacrifice was not unique. USS Colhoun, another Pickett destroyer, suffered a similar fate just days later. Struck by multiple suicide planes, she was left ablaze, her decks mangled, until she finally went under. For the men who survived, the memory was seared into their minds, the sound of screaming engines, the deck shuddering beneath impact, and the smell of burning fuel and flesh. These were the earliest tests of the radar picket line, and they proved both its brilliance and its brutal cost. But if Bush and Colhoun were martyrs of the new defensive wall, USS Laffey became its symbol of defiance. On April 16, 1945, stationed off Okinawa, Laffey faced one of the most ferocious kamikaze attacks of the war. For 80 minutes, she endured assault from 22 Japanese aircraft. Dive bombers, fighters, and suicide planes came in from every direction, hurling themselves at the destroyer. Her gunners fired until the barrels of their Oerlikons and Bofors glowed red. The ship shook under direct hits, bombs exploding amidships, kamikazes carving fiery scars into her deck. At one point, flames licked across her superstructure, ammunition detonated, and the ship seemed ready to die. Yet still she fought. When the smoke cleared, Laffey was barely afloat, battered by 6 kamikaze crashes and 4 bomb hits, with dozens of her crew dead. And yet, against all odds, she survived. Survivor testimonies reveal the harrowing ordeal. Sailors spoke of being drenched in burning fuel, of hauling wounded men from twisted wreckage, of praying that each incoming plane would miss. Some described time slowing down as kamikazes approached, watching the eyes of the pilots as they drove their planes downward. Others recalled a strange calm, the acceptance that death was seconds away. For many, it was the most terrifying experience of their lives, a crucible that defined them forever. These early battles on the radar line made clear that the Pickets were both saviors and sacrificial shields. Their warnings saved carriers and transports from sudden destruction, giving fighter patrols precious minutes to intercept. But by drawing Japanese fury, they became the most dangerous posts in the entire Pacific War. Sailors nicknamed it Picket Hell, and with good reason. Of the 101 destroyers assigned to radar duty off Okinawa, 10 were sunk and 32 damaged, casualties disproportionate to any other duty in the fleet. Yet commanders had no choice. Without the Pickets, the fleet would be blind to the kamikaze tide. The Japanese recognized this quickly. Their pilots were instructed to target the Pickets first, to burn away the eyes of the American fleet. And so, in the earliest weeks of the campaign, the line was tested in blood. Each sinking, each desperate battle, reinforced the deadly balance of the system. Survival of the fleet rested on the sacrifice of the few. The men aboard the Picket ships knew this truth with every passing day. In those first clashes, radar pickets demonstrated both the brilliance of Allied innovation and the terrible vulnerability of those chosen to defend it. Destroyers like Bush, Colhoun, and Laffey stood as grim symbols of a system that worked precisely because it placed men in harm's way. The line was holding, but the price was mounting, and the greatest test was still to come. The morning of April 16, 1945, dawned with a deceptive calm over the waters north of Okinawa. The destroyer USS Laffey, a battered but resolute veteran of Normandy and Leyte, rode at anchor on Radar Picket Station No. 1. Her mission was lonely and perilous: stand far from the protective mass of the fleet, sweep the skies with radar, and give early warning of Japanese air assaults. For her crew, the day began like so many others: dull gray seas, the constant drone of engines in the distance, and the weary routine of watches. But by mid-morning, that routine was shattered. The radar screens lit up with blips, a swarm of incoming contacts. The alarm bells clanged. Gunners scrambled to their stations, loaders hauled ammunition, and officers shouted commands across the decks. Above them, the first dark specks appeared against the sunlit sky. The kamikazes were coming. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary naval duels of the Pacific War. For 80 relentless minutes, Laffey stood alone against a storm of 22 attackers, Zero fighters, dive bombers, and suicide planes bent on annihilation. The ship's gunners fired until their hands blistered, the barrels of their oerlikons glowing red. The air was shredded by the bark of 40mm Bofors, the thunder of 5-inch guns, and the deafening roar of engines diving at terminal velocity. Each plane carried not just a bomb, but the will of a pilot determined to die. The first wave came in fast, splitting from multiple directions to overwhelm defenses. One plane burst apart under a direct hit, scattering burning fragments across the sea. Another spiraled downward, clipping the ship's mast before cartwheeling into the ocean. But others struck home. A bomb tore into the aft deck, blowing men and metal into the air. A kamikaze slammed into the port side, spraying the deck with flaming fuel. Shrapnel ripped across the gun crews, cutting down sailors in their stations. Yet even amid fire and carnage, the guns did not fall silent. Men stepped over the bodies of their shipmates to keep loading and firing. Witnesses later recalled the surreal intensity. Flames licked across the deck, smoke thickened into choking clouds, and the ship shuddered with each impact. Sailors worked in chaos, passing buckets of water hand to hand, dragging the wounded below, and firing blindly into the sky where the shriek of engines grew louder by the minute. At one point, a Zero dived straight at the bridge. The pilot's face was visible in the last seconds before impact, his eyes locked forward, his plane screaming down like a comet. The explosion blasted officers from their posts, the deck tilting under the force. Yet somehow the Laffey, though torn open and burning, stayed afloat. The Japanese attacks were methodical, unrelenting. As soon as one group was repelled, another appeared. Dive bombers swooped from altitude, while fighters came in at mast height, skimming the waves to strike the hull directly. The ship endured 6 kamikaze crashes and 4 bomb hits in less than 90 minutes. Entire gun mounts were obliterated, and yet the surviving crews shifted to remaining weapons. Sailors manned machine guns until ammunition was nearly exhausted, some firing sidearms as planes passed close overhead. Damage control parties sealed ruptured compartments, rigged hoses, and fought spreading fires with a ferocity equal to the gunners' determination. The ordeal was not fought alone. Overhead, American fighters scrambled to intercept, tearing into Japanese formations and reducing what might have been total annihilation to a brutal but survivable storm. Yet in those minutes when the Laffey was the primary target, survival depended entirely on the courage and stubbornness of her crew. The destroyer earned her nickname in those hours, the ship that would not die. By the time the last attacker broke off, the Laffey was a wrecked silhouette in the water. Her decks were scorched black, her superstructure pitted with holes, and her crew bloodied and exhausted. 71 men lay dead or missing, with many more wounded. Yet the destroyer still floated. Pumps beat back the flooding, fires were slowly contained, and the ship limped back toward the fleet. The radar picket had endured one of the most ferocious suicide assaults of the war, and survived to tell the tale. The Battle of Radar Picket Station No. 1 was more than a single ship's ordeal. It symbolized the paradox of the radar picket system, its genius and its cost. By standing in the path of the storm, Laffey bought precious minutes for the fleet behind her. Her suffering meant carriers and transports could prepare, fighters could be vectored into position, and thousands of men might live. Yet it also demonstrated how exposed the picket ships were, how their very role guaranteed they would be the first struck and the hardest hit. For the Japanese, the attack was both a demonstration of fury and a grim revelation. Even massed assaults could not guarantee the destruction of an American destroyer. Radar, flak, and sheer determination combined to deny them the clean victory they sought. For the Americans, the lesson was just as sharp. Victory came not from invulnerability, but from resilience. The radar pickets could not expect safety, but they could hold the line long enough for the fleet to endure. The memory of that day lingered with every survivor. Men recalled the sound of engines that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the sight of shipmates consumed in fire, the sensation that each second might be their last. They also remembered the stubborn pride when the battered Laffy refused to sink, her flag still flying through smoke and ruin. Radar Picket Station Number 1 became a legend, a story of endurance at the edge of survival. As Okinawa raged on, more picket ships would face similar ordeals, but none would match the concentrated fury unleashed on Laffy. The battle was the climax of the radar line's struggle, a moment when technology, human courage, and sheer will collided with an enemy willing to die to win. It ended not with a glorious victory or a clean defeat, but with a battered ship limping home, proof that even against the fiercest storm, survival was possible if men refused to yield. The cockpit smelled of oil and sweat as the young Japanese pilot gripped the stick of his aging Zero, the roar of the engine vibrating through his bones. Below him stretched the endless blue of the East China Sea, broken only by flecks of whitecaps. He had been told that if he flew low and fast, hugging the waves, he might evade detection and slip through to strike at the American fleet. But before his squadron even saw their targets, the sky erupted. Black bursts of flak cracked overhead, and tracer fire streaked in precise arcs. From nowhere, American fighters appeared, their wings flashing silver as they dove. Panic surged in his chest. How had they known? His mission had barely begun, yet already it was unraveling. The promise of surprise drilled into him by instructors and commanders was a lie. For many kamikaze pilots, Okinawa was the first battlefield where reality stripped away the illusions of certainty. Instructors had promised that sacrifice would guarantee success, that by flying with determination, a single man could sink a carrier and alter the war's fate. Yet again and again, pilots found themselves detected before they reached their targets. Radar pickets stationed far from the main fleet ensured that their approach was no secret. Even when they pressed forward, they were met not by undefended decks, but by a wall of flak and swarms of American fighters. For some, the realization came in mid-air, with tracer rounds shattering their cockpits. For others, it came on the ground, when comrades failed to return, their names added to the lists of the dead, with little evidence they had achieved anything at all. Captured diaries and post-war testimonies reveal the erosion of morale. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who led the first official kamikaze unit at Leyte Gulf, had already expressed doubts months before Okinawa, writing that he did not believe suicide tactics could win the war. Japan's salvation, he wrote, does not lie in young men dying gloriously, but in victory itself. By 1945, many pilots shared his private skepticism, though they kept it hidden behind ritual bows and ceremonial sake. Diaries recovered from the wreckage of aircraft at Okinawa often contain similar themes: quiet resignation, fleeting thoughts of family, and doubts about whether their deaths would matter. One pilot scrawled in his journal the night before takeoff, "If radar sees us, then how can we reach them? I go because I must, but perhaps I go only to vanish." The American radar picket line amplified these doubts. Positioned like sentinels far from the carriers, destroyers such as USS Laffy, USS Bush, and USS Evans absorbed the first wave of kamikaze fury. For Japanese pilots, this meant their path to the main fleet was never clear. Instead of diving onto a carrier deck, many found themselves locked in duels with destroyers bristling with guns. These small ships, seemingly insignificant compared to the vast carriers, became deadly guardians. Pilots who expected to pierce the heart of the fleet instead perished in walls of anti-aircraft fire before they even glimpsed their intended targets. Post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese officers confirmed the shock. Pilots returned from failed missions spoke of their disbelief that the Americans always seemed ready, no matter the hour or direction of approach. Some suspected spies on the ground in Kyushu, Others believed American aircraft had supernatural range. Only later did many understand that radar had stripped away their last advantage. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, one of the architects of the Kamikaze program, reflected in his writings after the war that radar had turned courage into futility. His words capture the tragedy. The devotion of young men was real, but their chances were illusory. The despair was compounded by the visible attrition of comrades. At Kyushu airfields, pilots gathered for breakfast, knowing that by sunset, some seats would be empty forever. As the weeks wore on, more chairs remained unoccupied, and more lockers stood closed with names painted over in white. Survivors wrote of a gnawing dread, not of death itself, but of death without meaning. Each failed sortie meant more lives consumed for less effect. Even among Japan's militarist leaders, there were quiet doubts. Yet the machinery of sacrifice continued, fueled by ideology and desperation. American accounts often describe the eerie determination of kamikazes, pilots pressing through fire and steel until the last second. But from the cockpit perspective, many of those final moments were not serene acceptance, but fear and futility. Diaries recovered from downed aircraft sometimes contained hurried final entries, written minutes before takeoff. I fear my death will achieve nothing. I am only one among so many who vanish into the sea. The very men hailed as symbols of divine sacrifice often carried within them private doubts that never reached their commanders. The lesson became unavoidable as sorties mounted. Of the more than 1,500 kamikaze missions launched at Okinawa, the vast majority were destroyed before reaching their targets. A fraction broke through, inflicting grievous losses, but the overwhelming reality was failure at the cost of irreplaceable lives. In the cockpits of those planes, the shock was personal and immediate. The realization that technology had outstripped devotion, and that radar made their sacrifice predictable rather than decisive. This dawning awareness undermined not only morale, but strategy itself. Japan's gamble at Okinawa depended on the cumulative weight of sacrifice, on the notion that thousands of men flinging themselves at the American fleet could shatter its resolve. Instead, the attrition fell hardest on Japan. Each failed sortie drained the last reserves of trained pilots and usable aircraft. Each death deepened the futility of the enterprise. Even in their final hours, many kamikaze pilots sensed this bitter truth, though bound by honor and duty to carry on. The shock waves in those cockpits were not only explosions of flak and fire, they were realizations of futility. The pilots who looked down through windshields at Picket destroyers bristling with guns understood that their sacrifice was no longer the decisive blow they had been promised. It was a gesture, tragic and futile, against an enemy whose invisible eyes ensured they could not surprise, could not slip through, could not win. And as Okinawa dragged on, each mission became less about victory and more about the slow, grinding collapse of Japan's air power. The waters off Okinawa were still littered with oil, twisted metal, and silent hulks when the guns finally fell quiet in the summer of 1945. Survivors from the radar Picket destroyers, men who had stood watch against the storm, carried home memories carved in fire and steel. Some had been pulled from blackened decks, their skin burned and their ears ringing from the thunder of kamikaze impacts. Others lived with the guilt of having survived when shipmates had not. In ports across America, families received telegrams that spoke in cold language of ships lost and loved ones missing. But the men who had lived through the radar line knew the truth. Okinawa had demanded a price almost beyond endurance. That price was measured not only in ships sunk and sailors killed, but in scars that lingered long after the war. Radar picket duty became synonymous with sacrifice. Destroyers like USS Bush, Colquhoun, and Pringle went down under waves of suicide planes, their crews left clinging to debris. Others, like USS Laffey, survived assaults that seemed impossible, limping back to port as blackened wrecks but refusing to sink. Of the 101 destroyers rotated through picket stations at Okinawa, More than a third were sunk or damaged. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed in the campaign, the majority in the battles waged on the radar line. The very success of the system, the ability to shield the fleet by standing exposed, was built upon the willingness of those crews to endure unrelenting attack. Yet out of that crucible came lessons that shaped the future of naval warfare. The concept of a forward warning line, of small ships extending the vision of a larger fleet, became doctrine in the Cold War era. During the 1950s, destroyers and frigates armed with radar and later missile systems took positions far from carrier groups, forming defensive screens against Soviet bombers and eventually long-range missiles. The principle pioneered at Okinawa, the sacrifice of the few to protect the many, echoed in the design of Aegis cruisers, airborne early warning aircraft, and modern missile defense systems. Today, when American warships patrol the oceans with phased array radars and interceptors ready to strike down incoming threats, they trace their lineage back to those fragile destroyers that stood on the line in 1945. But for all its technological legacy, the story of the radar pickets is above all a human one. It is the story of boys who became sailors, manning guns until their hands bled, steering ships through fire, and dragging wounded comrades from burning decks. It is the story of engineers and scientists who gave those sailors the tools of survival, turning invisible radio waves into shields against death. And it is the story of sacrifice made tangible, men who stood on the edge of annihilation so that the fleet behind them might live. The radar picket line at Okinawa endures as both symbol and warning. It showed how ingenuity could counter even the most desperate tactics, but also how survival in total war demanded blood as well as brilliance. The destroyers that guarded the fleet became legends not because they were invincible, but because they refused to yield when everything seemed lost. Their legacy lives on not just in strategy and technology, but in the memory of their sacrifice, carved into the history of naval warfare as a reminder that even the most advanced shield is held up by human hands.